Elaina, we're just after having the council meeting here in the beautiful Woodlands House Hotel. What was the mood like amongst ITIC members?
Well, first and foremost, I was delighted to welcome everybody here to the Midwest and to Limerick and to Adare and to our own hotel. And I suppose it was great to kind of that we had an opportunity to have a regional meeting after so long. So that aspect was absolutely wonderful. It was great to hear, I suppose, stories about growth in terms of the progress that's been made. I suppose in many respects, there's been an unexpected buoyancy and it came upon us a lot quicker than we ever would have anticipated or materialized. And great credit to all, politically in terms of the organizations and right down to the businesses, communities, families, everybody who came together to make it happen. And really with that, I suppose, quest of delivering the best possible experiences. But there is no doubt that there is a real sense of shifting sands. It's not just the end of traditional tourism season, but it's all that's happening in terms of we've seen, months of inflation, hyperinflation, that doesn't really seem to be an end in sight in terms of where it's going. We're seeing inflation across all of our inputs, so at some stages, it was obviously increased labor costs. And I suppose in recognition of the upskilling that people did in particular, and in recognition of the scaling up of the industry after being closed and quasi-closed for so long, that was absolutely, perfectly understandable. And I suppose too, we've invested a lot in our products, so it's great to see that same investment in our people as well too. Obviously inputs, I know in terms of our own business, one day cream went up 100% and you're kind of like, was that a different product to yesterday?
Yeah.
But now all of the focus is on energy, and I mean it's absolutely crippling. We've seen it, like anecdotally, we've seen that there's a tripling of costs. There are very stark statistics available in terms of, energy, how it's so much more expensive here, compared to the rest of Europe. And I suppose with the upcoming budget, there's a real sense of what's going to happen here to assist members across that right now, but
and
that towards the future from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah, and sorry, I suppose it seems like a very short honeymoon, kind of post-COVID. There was those few short months of, as you said, buoyant business, and then suddenly, the Ukraine war, the inflation pressures have come at us like a ton of bricks, and it's across all sectors of the tourism community, isn't it? It's hotels, attractions. Airlines are suffering with their fuel prices, coach companies and diesel, restaurants. I mean, it's a perfect storm to a certain extent.
It is. This is 200% not a normal year. You have so many variables. I suppose, the much heralded and the relief that came with, that January announcement of restrictions being lifted. But it took months in terms of lead times to see how that manifested. And then it kind of came together. And there's a combination of factors. You deferred bookings, you pent up demand, you had, savings. You had, I suppose, there was a difficulty or a challenge around the pipeline of tourism services being developed throughout the pandemic, because of course you couldn't work at particular times. Obviously, government contracts had increased. So all of those factors came together. And equally, I think what would have happened as well is in terms of resources, there was so much more resources put into structures of buildings, even in terms of sometimes we would remark at times you had two people perhaps to do the job that maybe one person would have done before. And so, yes, there was a buoyancy, but there was a huge increase in the cost base. But I think people were so glad to get open. They were so glad to start, doing what they did best without maybe looking over your shoulder in terms of when are we going to potentially see the next break on it, so I think all of those things came together, and I would honestly say I felt there was huge pressure in terms of delivering service, but now it's a different kind of pressure because maybe the lever that we had of that first maybe 5 or 6 months of kind of enhanced business, there isn't enough evidence to suggest that that's going to continue. And if anything, we could have the double whammy effect. So people's disposable income is going to go down. In the US, they're talking about 5 quarters of negative growth. In the UK, oh my God, the inflationary statistics are just astounding.
Staggering.
Astounding. I don't think I've ever heard or seen anything like that in my lifetime, in terms of particularly so close to home. So there really is a huge amount of trepidation. And there's a lot of pressure on government because you do have obviously the cost of business crisis, but you have the cost of living crisis as well. And big decisions to be made.
Yeah, and just in terms of those big decisions, so, you know, as you say, 2023 is looking like a challenging year, and we're very exposed as an industry with kind of modest profit margins and very labor intensive. Government obviously have the budget in, you know, a couple of short weeks. What can government do to, if you like, support our sector and support the tourism and hospitality family?
Okay, so how can we mitigate it? There's a few things. So VAT at 9% for me is the forerunner. I mean, the
Yeah.
notion of moving from 9% potentially back to where we were at 13.5%, that's a 50% increase. Like, that's just huge in terms of the times that we're in, and the inflationary pressure is there. And I know the figure was recently put out there that by moving VAT, you know, back up to 13.5%, it's potentially adding another, you know, 0.5% rate to inflation. Now,
Yeah.
that's just an untenable thing, you know, at this time to be even thinking about. And particularly against, I suppose, what we see is potential a decline in demand as well.
Yeah.
I think there's already evidence of that. So we haven't even got back to 2019
Yeah.
statistics. You know, every month, yes, it's great and there's a consistency, but there is a continued minimal of 10% in those key summer months. And that's going to become more as we head into kind of the off peak in the winter period. And that's a long period ahead. And that, so VAT is critical, and a lot of contracting is done 2 years in advance. I mean, I'm contracting now for 2024 and really no idea of where to pitch it. And again, with all the inflationary pressure, but it's the one controllable that government really have is around VAT. And I suppose it's critical. We do see it as being the right rate. And if you look across Europe, if we go back up, there'll only be Denmark above us. If we stay where we are, we're an even keel. So from a competitive perspective, because we already have the challenge of, you know, being an island and in terms of accessibility, I think that's a key thing.
And yet just on that, at the moment, government policy is that VAT goes back up to 13.5% on February 28th. So in budget, we want some positive news that the VAT at 9 will remain in place.
Correct. That's exactly it, that it's not just a temporary measure, that there's a sunset clause, that there is a commitment around it, particularly in the not so normal year that we have now, and certainly in terms of the modest, you know, year that's going to be ahead in 2023. I suppose the other things that we're looking at, Owen, would be measures to be put in place in terms of the current energy crisis that we have. I mean, it's just not sustainable. Like, some of the figures in terms of going up hundreds of percent. I mean, we've seen so much evidence of how it's playing out, and there's no way that many businesses, numbers and figures will add up. And particularly after the end of the traditional summer season, you know, the off-peak season is a long one as well too. So we do need to see measures around that, but equally, I think we need to have a little bit more of a forward vision when it comes to energy and renewables. Quite simply, there is a lot of work to be done in this space. I suppose in many respects, there is a great readiness amongst industry, and, you know, maybe access to the type of services and you know, subsidies and grants and low cost loans and all the different versions of them. I don't think that we have really seen the most efficient version of that. And that, so it's a question of how we harness all of that together, because there's very strong energy targets in place. And at the end of the day, this is something that we should be excelling at in terms of our economy, in terms of the type of tourism business that we have. We have an opportunity to be world class when it comes to this. And it's how you bring that education piece together, how you bring that financial piece together, and that. But like, we want and need to be front leaders, and there's only one way that can go. You know, it has to become a serious commitment.
You're dead right there. And ITIC obviously published a report on sustainability back in April, and you're right. There's huge willingness there, and there's a lot of good things happening. But it needs, you know, the big ticket items, I think, need to be enabled by the industry so that, you know, we're green in nature and green in practice.
Correct. And there's great pockets of expertise, but it's just bringing things together cohesively. So there's a much more strategic approach, but how it translates then onto the ground in terms of the accessibility of it to tourism operators, and obviously, look, a broader business and society. I really feel there's so much more that can be done. And I'm very conscious as well, like, this is what our customers value. This is what they want. You know, we are, I suppose, quite blessed to have a, you know, a green, a hugely green influence in our government as well. And it would be lovely and not just lovely. I mean, I think the time has come where it really has to become part of our everyday ethos.
Yeah.
But it's almost like we need to recalibrate to make sure that we go in the right direction, we do it cohesively, and we get the best out of it. And look, at the end of the day, that we're the country that's been written about in the future because we've got it so right.
Yeah. And I know sustainability is going to be probably at the heart of the new national tourism policy next year. So I think you're right. I think the government and the state have to play their role in terms of enabling us, the industry, to if you like, do the stuff that we want to. Just on back to the budget, just in terms of things like investment and expenditure. I mean, tourism did quite well in a way out of COVID because there was a record level of investment in tourism. And there's talk of that being cut back to 2019 levels because obviously, please God, COVID is behind us. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose, look, 2021 was hugely important in terms of that budget announcement for this year. And I think the return has been quite strong. And, I don't think we would have had the growth that we had was it not for, the continuity grants, that huge investment that we saw in tourism marketing. And I know my position and that of ITIC is as it is across broader tourism, is really on point in terms of the importance of that investment being sustained. We need to see that continued investment in marketing in terms of what it can deliver. As it's not that long ago the tourism was contributing 2 billion to our exchequer.
Yeah.
There are 270,000 livelihoods supported by tourism, and there are whole communities supported by tourism. 70% of tourism jobs are actually outside of Dublin.
Yeah.
So there is a huge footprint of tourism. And I think what we saw during COVID was, that local suppliers, retail, I even see at a local level here in Adare, how that was affected.
Yeah.
So that investment in marketing tourism, and look, all the statistics are there in terms of when you spend, a euro on marketing, I think it's 23 cents or something pretty high, makes its way back into the exchequer. So, if you put the money in, you're going to get the investment back, and obviously supporting all those livelihoods. And I suppose livelihoods that have been more affected, over the course of the last few years.
And investment, Elaina, is important for the industry, but also for agencies, isn't it?
Hugely. I mean, we look at, I suppose, the unexpected buoyancy that we've had, because whilst, yes, we are behind in terms of where we were in 2019, it still is considerably better than what would have been forecast at the beginning of the year. And I suppose great credit is due to Tourism Ireland in terms of all that they do. And I mean, keeping, I suppose, the lights on when effectively you're closed as an island destination is incredibly difficult. And, the Press the Green Button initiative, the IMAP initiative, there were some great initiatives put in place. And I think you really see how it's paid dividend in terms of keeping Ireland top of mind. And I am very, very grateful because I fully appreciate the difficulties around trying to sell, a product or a country that essentially wasn't open. And I suppose the other side of that then, Owen, is, throughout the pandemic, I suppose Fáilte Ireland were very, very quick to come to the support of tourism. Whether it was training, and there was a number of different grant schemes, I suppose in terms of the infrastructure, what we've seen, the developments there, what has been made available to the teams that work with us, in terms of at a general manager, proprietor, owner level. I mean, it really has been extraordinary. So in some respects, whilst, you couldn't be opening your business, those supports essentially helped you to keep the lights on, keep your product developing, keep your team developing. And in turn, then, I suppose, if you look at things like around the COVID safety schemes, etc., people opened with a great sense of reassurance. And that as well. And look, it was a tremendously difficult time with ever-changing movement, but there was a real sense of, Fáilte Ireland being with us every step of the way. And I think that has really paid dividend in terms of, staycations, the value that was placed in them, and certainly in terms of our overall growth and betterment, I may add, in terms of the facilities, the product, as a tourism sector. Equally, I suppose there's a few other measures we'd like to see. I mean, we'd like to see an opportunity around VRT being reclaimed of that in terms of trying to, I suppose, build car rental fleets. I think that's really, really important. And equally in terms of our regional airport funding, and particularly around sustainable fuels. I suppose it's important that we look at all of our airports, you know, and I suppose just that there's an opportunity to grow those, particularly where there's capacity. And that as well, and equally in terms of no more than when we talk about tourism, so whether it's hotels, restaurant, visitor attractions, you know, it's important that from a transportation perspective, that the whole, I suppose, sustainable ethos, that there is, you know, I suppose strategies and enablers and funding put in place to make sure that we're going in the best possible direction with that.
Absolutely. You were president of the IHF for 2 years, and it was the 2 years of COVID. Was it April you became chair of ITIC, which is obviously the umbrella group for the broader industry, and now we're bang in the middle of a war on the European continent and energy inflation and all sorts of economic doom and gloom. You're a real glutton for punishment, Elaina.
Not a glutton for punishment. I suppose if I look back in the IHF, I mean, on my very first day in the role back in late February 2020, we had our first COVID meeting. Now, did we ever think of where we'd go? But I suppose, and I do look at it as a real privilege that I could be there, that I was close enough to our own team, our own community, to really know the value and the importance of what we did. And I am very grateful to how people came together, you know, to try and ensure that we all cumulatively survived. At a basic level, you know, you don't have to dig too deep to find the motivation. But my colleagues, my tourism colleagues, not just in the hotel industry, but across broader tourism, were incredible in terms of their resilience and their can-do attitude. And I suppose we did get significant support from government, because quite simply, without those supports, there would be no tourism industry. But it's funny, the whole 2 years of my presidency were, I suppose, framed by the pandemic. And as I said, privileged to be close to it and to, you know, be able to try and get the best version of what we could in terms of, I suppose, taking those baby steps into recovery. And so I'm really, really glad to have the opportunity to, you know, be part of the ITIC, I suppose, tourism family, because that's how I see it. Where tourism is at a much broader level, I suppose, taking you out of your little box in terms of hotels and guest houses and that. But I'm so glad to have an opportunity and to be able to contribute, you know, something that goes beyond the pandemic. For me, it's really important that I have an opportunity to contribute to tourism policy, to make sure that the industry that I've been born into, love, adore, thrive, and you know, that it can be the best version that it could be. And I'm also very, very conscious, I suppose, of the 270,000 people whose livelihoods are supported by tourism. I want it to be the best experience for them, that people have an opportunity to grow where they want to. And I suppose it's great to be part of the ITIC family now that we can drive on post-pandemic. Unfortunately, we have this incredible crisis, you know, right now in terms of inflation, etc. But our tourism product is good and it's very strong. And I suppose it's making sure that we continue to deliver from a value perspective. So within our own businesses and communities, we have an opportunity to do that. But equally, government have a huge opportunity, particularly in the context of the budget. And I think that's, you know, it's about making sure that we get the best version of sustainable growth that we can. And we've all recalibrated, I suppose, as a tourism community in terms of what we do, you know, where we're going in terms of our own businesses, you know, the people that we bring along the journey with us. Our guests have changed considerably. And it's not just in terms of international, you know, it's what they want, you know, and how are we creating those lifetime experiences. So look, it's a great and a very dynamic industry to be in. And for me, I suppose it's really important to be able to shape the policy in what I hope will be a growth phase for Irish tourism. And look, it's not a full, you know, return to 2019 levels isn't expected until 2026, but it's what we as an organization can do to edge us that little bit closer and to be world class.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the industry, Elaina, is very lucky to have you at the helm. And you know, we talk about this crisis, but you know, that phrase, this too shall pass, you know, 9/11, foot and mouth, the ash cloud, the financial crash, you know, tourism was very vulnerable to each of those shocks and yet recovered and went on to better things. So that's what we hope's ahead of us. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the brilliant meeting we had in the Woodlands House Hotel in Adare, and onwards and upwards.
Thanks very much, Owen.